A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS book discussion titled Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. The discussion draws on Professor Sugata Bose's new book titled Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. The book interprets artistic, literary, and political interactions across Asia by tracking the intersecting journeys of an array of Asian intellectual and cultural figures. To commence the discussion, I would like to invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, the Director for the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, to deliver his welcome remarks. Dr. Sevia, all yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Mr. George Yeo, visiting scholar, founding patron, Asia Competitiveness Institute, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, and former Foreign Minister of Singapore. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I'm delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to our book discussion titled Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. It's our pleasure to be hosting Professor Sugata Bose and the fellow panelists who will be discussing the book and the major ideas that arise from this book. Now, I don't want to preempt anything that the panelists and the author themselves will say. And of course, I don't want to even attempt or pretend to preempt anything that Mr. George Yeo will speak on. But formality demands that I say something. So I have to fill this space for 5 minutes. So I thought what I'll do is I'll take two words out of the title and sort of hope to lay some sort of a broader framework for what the discussion will be. And these two terms that I'll pick on are one, Asia, go figure, right? And the other, imagining. Now let me start with Asia. Where is Asia? What is Asia? Is there something unique to this beast we call Asia? Now, we know that there is nothing natural about regions, right? They're constructed, they're populated, they act in certain ways or don't act in certain ways. But when we deal with these terms, Asia, Europe, etc., should we deal with them merely as cartographical or geopolitical creations of the Western powers? Or do we then also have to focus on the various visions, contesting that as they may be, but visions nonetheless that have populated the boundaries that have been drawn on the map? This is a question that's not only of relevance to historians and geopoliticians, but also to everyone today, because we hear very much about the rise of Asia and what this is going to imply for the global economy. We also are in the midst of witnessing various geopolitical formulations about the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and Asia is being recrafted in a sense with what's happening now. So these are the differing visions of Asia, Asianness, and Asia's position in the world that we are actually witnessing at this very moment, but we are also witnessing a re-emphasis on the global south. What does the global south mean? And I think that has relevance to the questions that are discussed in this book. So I will propose that instead of just looking at the term as a cartographical term or geopolitical term, we seek to understand this term through the genealogy of the term itself. And when I say genealogies, I don't mean the origins of the term, but rather how this term has come to evolve, how it's been used, how it's been contested, and how it's been seen by those who live in the region itself. And to do this, we need to pay attention to how Asian intellectuals, statesmen, stateswomen, leaders, etc., have imagined the region, and how they've developed discourses of regionalism and universalism. And I'm sure these will be topics that we'll be discussing today. And one thing that will come out from the discussions themselves is the fact that the anti-colonial struggle and the early period of independence was a very vibrant period in which we saw a number of nationalist figures dealing with this term about Asia. If you look at writings of nationalist figures, you find sometimes they use Asia, sometimes they use the term East as well. And these definitions are important here. For my own work, I work on the South Asian subcontinent, and I know that in the independence struggle, and this is something I'm sure Professor Bose would also talk about in his presentation, and I know it's dealt with in the book extensively, nationalist figures in India, and I talk India because pre-1947 period it was India, what you found was when they spoke, many of them spoke about the independence of India, they related it to the independence of the East or the re-empowerment of Asia itself. And I'll be remiss if I don't quote a couplet here, so please forgive my Urdu. But the famous Urdu poet Muhammad Iqbal wrote, "खबर की उम्मीद का यही खाक है मरकज़, इकबाल की अशकों से यही खाक है सिराब," which roughly, and I'm butchering it by translating it, but the translation actually means that India's independence is of relevance not just to India, but it is the ummeed or the hope of Asia and of the East, because the land of India has been nurtured by the tears of nationalist figures like Iqbal and others. So they didn't see it just as an empowerment of India, but a bigger, wider question about the East and its position with relations to Asia. And of course, there's a much longer history to this genealogy, and that's where our panelists will come in, and they'll expand the time frame itself. But the other term, and I'll be very brief here, that I want to also highlight before I hand over the floor, is the term imagining. Now, in 1983, Benedict Anderson wrote a very, very influential book, which was titled Imagined Communities. In that book, he essentially, successfully I should say, made the argument that the nation state and nationalism are not natural, they are imagined into existence. Now, this book was highly influential because it made everybody start thinking in terms of how nation states were imagined. But there was a slight issue with this book, because what it did was it then presented the Western imagination of the nation state as the culmination of political thought. And so what you have is then modular forms of political organization that Asian states had to adopt to, adjust to, and either reject, accept, or just live with. But what we find in books like Professor Sugata Bose's book is how this is not the case. We need to pay attention to exactly how things are imagined, and those imaginations may not fall in line with Western political theories' imagination of political organization. So I would urge us that when we think about the term imagination in political thought itself, don't just pay attention to the political theorists and politicians and statesmen and stateswomen, but also artists. But also pay attention to things like food, culinary habits, how comportment plays in these issues as well. So I would urge us to think more broadly about these two categories, Asia and imagining. Now, I'm going to stop here, but I have to say a few thank yous before I cede the floor. And of course, I would firstly like to thank Mr. George Yeo for accepting our invitation and kindly agreeing to deliver the keynote address, which I'm sure many of us are looking forward to. I would then also like to thank Ambassador Kesavapani, and I would like to acknowledge that this book discussion is actually something that a conversation that he initiated has culminated in this, so thank you very much. I also like to thank the ICES events team led by Jordan. It's been a busy week for ICES. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. Yesterday, we hosted the president at a gala dinner. So it's been a busy week for Jordan. So thank you so much, Jordan, for putting this together as well. And with that, like all of you, I look forward to the keynote panel and the discussion that will follow. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Savia. I would now like to invite Mr. George Yeo, visiting scholar and founding patron, Asia Competitiveness Institute, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS, and former Foreign Minister of Singapore, to deliver the keynote address. Mr. Yeo, please.
Sugata, Iqbal, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here. I accepted immediately when Sugata asked me to give a speech at the launch of his book today, a book which I read with pleasure. Those who, when we talk about Asia, we're talking principally about India and China, because these are the two big poles, the two big civilizations, which develop independently, each recognizing the other as an ancient people, separated by the forbidding heights of the Himalayas, the Pamirs, deserts, and the islands and archipelagos, and the diseases of Southeast Asia. There's huge prejudice between one and the other, but each doffs his hat to the other. And I always remember the event in front of the Tiantan, the the temple where they conduct imperial sacrifices outside Beijing, Tiantan. How do you translate it in English? Temple of Heaven. On the steps of the Temple of Heaven, a simultaneous display to Modi and to Li Keqiang of yoga and Tai Chi. Each a window with profound insights, not only into the unity of spirit, mind, and body, but the connection of the body to nature. You know, those who hope that China will fall into another Thucydides trap with India, I think will be disappointed. And Sugata's book, it reads so differently from the Peloponnesian War, because it talks about a larger humanity and the importance of peace, of love. And it's a recurrent theme by the great thinkers and philosophers, when both embarked on their march to independence and national liberation. In both, the justification was a greater universality, a larger humanism. But reading the current tensions between China and India, there is a flutter of hope among some of our Western friends that perhaps it will get worse and that there's opportunity in this conflict. You know, when Modi visited Russia recently, I was watching the videos of how he and Putin interacted with one another. Kishore told me last night, at the 20th anniversary of ISAS, that a friend of his in Beijing told him that they were so well covered in China. The Chinese were very happy that India's relations with Russia are good and getting better. Russia talks about resuming the trilateral summit of Russia, India, and China. There was an SCO summit in Astana about 2 weeks ago. And Modi couldn't go because Parliament was on in Delhi. So Jai Shankar was there. Jai Shankar met Wang Yi. And both met, they agreed to redouble efforts to improve bilateral relations and to diffuse military tensions along the border region. People wonder why Modi made this visit to Russia and with so much fanfare. He must know the Americans won't be happy. He must know. But he did it deliberately. And I wonder why. And when Russia hosts BRICS summit in Kazan in October, how will Putin bring Modi and Xi Jinping together? I suspect something's afoot, which explains how the Chinese are reporting Modi's visit to Moscow. But let's watch this space. When we read Sugata's book, then we say, no, but this is to be expected, because the tensions between the two are artificial. And if you dig all the way down, it's a bit ridiculous. The Raj never demarcated the boundaries of India with the boundaries of China. Never. The McMahon line was drawn in the east. It was never recognized by Beijing at a time when London recognized Beijing as suzerain over Tibet. And in Ladakh, there was no agreement. The British drew different lines at different times. And the concern sometimes, very often, was how to shore up the Qing dynasty in order to keep up the Russians who were coming down. So Kissinger often said that to understand the strategy of the British Empire at the time, one had to understand the importance of British India to London. So it's natural that there are border conflicts. You know, in China, many people are not aware that there was a war in 62. The history of that war is interesting. Nehru had his forward policy. It's still sensitive in India. Till today, the Henderson Brooks Bhagat report is still a classified document after so many years, when everyone knows what's inside, you know, but it's still classified. So when Gawan happened, and 20 Indians were killed, Indian soldiers were killed, or died. I'm not sure they were killed, but 20 died. Some because they were on a precipice and might have fallen down the cliff. The Chinese were very righteous. They said, no, India started this. They deserve it, more or less. India, of course, are outraged. And I talked to both sides. Each believes that it's the other side which has provoked the conflict and led them to the current situation. And they believe it passionately because I engaged them privately. And they spoke with emotion to me. I scratched my head, I studied the map, I said, well, no, at that altitude where oxygen is very low, and I mean, it's a really God-forsaken terrain. And it doesn't make sense to expend so much nervous energy over there. You know, China had these quarrels with Russia over their boundary. And they fought a war at the Ussuri River. You know, the current president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, he used to be a diplomat here. Then when he was in the Soviet Union, he was in the border negotiations with China. So when the border was finally settled, he was the speaker of Kazakhstan. I knew him, so I said, what do you think of the agreement? He said, oh, more or less what we expected. Maybe Russia gave in a little more to China. In the end, it was settled. And today, no one bothers. Between India and Bangladesh, it was insoluble because there were so many disputed areas. But one day, like the Gordian knot, the decision was taken, it's resolved. And so too one day with the border between India and China. But it will not come immediately. I hope that some improvements will come as all sides recognize that a multipolar world requires the various parties to behave in a more balanced, subtle way. And when we go back to the past, it's much easier to find our way to the future, which is the value in Sugata's book. I mean, he talks about Tagore, he talks about Netaji, he talks about the early nationalists, and how they view each other as fellow human beings, as fellow Asians. I don't believe there is enmity between Modi and Xi Jinping. At their first retreat in Ahmedabad, Modi hosted Xi Jinping, celebrating, I think, the 5th century, a Gujarati monk who helped bring Buddhism to India. And in return, when Xi Jinping hosted a retreat in Xi'an, he brought Modi to the giant goose pagoda, Tayenta, where Xuanzang, whom all Indian would have read in the history books, retired to translate the sutras. And then in the later visit, it was in Mahabalipuram, in the deep south. Why Mahabalipuram? Because on the temple frieze, where there are hundreds of gods, there's one with a Chinese face. And Fa Xian in the 5th century recorded that he was in Kanchipuram before going to Sri Lanka. And maybe that was him. So in their interactions, and there were many between them, they always recalled the past and how each learned from the other. I knew Sugata because for 10 years we were involved in reviving Nalanda University. It was a wonderful journey that we tracked because we talk about how civilizations met, how they learned from each other, how they inspired one another, and why the revival of that institution is the most natural thing on earth, because the history of Nalanda long forgotten in India, was recovered through Chinese records. When Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, chanced upon the translation of a record by Xuanzang written in the 7th century, the Da Tang Si Ji, never lost in East Asia, but completely forgotten in India. I mean, pictures of the library in Nalanda were drawn in Kamakura, in Japan, because they all read the same text. So when we embarked on this journey, we thought this would be a wonderful bridge connecting two civilizations. But of course, the university has taken on the different turning because of Hindu nationalism in India. But I think eventually the river will find its way to the sea because the idea is too big to be overcome by current, contemporary political issues. And I often wonder why in the Nalanda committee there were so many Bengalis, you know. I mean, we had Amartya Sen, we had Sugata, we had Tan Sen. And I said there's something about that land. So Sugata, he brought me to Netaji's house, he brought me to Netaji's brother's house, his, your grandfather, or great-grandfather, grandfather. I listened to Netaji's speeches. One day, he brought me to a political rally in Calcutta where Mamata Banerjee spoke. There were 1 million people. They wanted to put me in front. I said, no. I'll sit at the back from where I had a vantage view of the scale of the Indian drama. It's the same scale in China. These are two great peoples, two great civilizations. But in Bengal, I do not know why. Maybe that's where the waters mix. Maybe that's where the great rivers flow to the Bay of Bengal. It created Buddhism. I was in Bangladesh a few months ago, and they brought me to the birthplace of Atisha, that famous Bengali monk who, after studying Nalanda, went to Sumatra. From Sumatra, went back to Vikramshila, and in his 40s went up to the Tibetan plateau and transformed Buddhism on that plateau. And is well known in Tibet, in Bhutan, but not in China. But Zhou Enlai had the wisdom to give pieces of the remains of Atisha in Tibet to Pakistan. But then the war broke out in 1972 under Ziaur Rahman. Relations were established with China. Then the relics found their way to Bangladesh. So I visited it. I thought, what an undervalued site. There are hardly any tourists. No one knows about it. Yeah, it's so important, and it tells what a wonderful story connecting Southeast Asia to India, to Tibet and China. The tapestry which Sugata weave, many of us from different fields can weave more threads into them. And when we take a step back and look at the tapestry, and we say, where will this lead us to? I think it will lead to something very precious, which is India and China bound together not by Thucydidean considerations, but by Panchil, by the 5 principles. China celebrated it last month. Dino Jala was there. So I said, Dino, was India represented? He said, no. But it was the formulation in the original agreement between India and China. India called it Panchil because it means 5 principles. So it was, to me, painful that for this 70th celebration, the two sides could not come together and rejoice that they've laid something which, for all of humanity. In a multipolar world, this is the only basis for peace on earth. The only basis. When we look at the 5 principles, mutual non-interference, cooperation, equality, non-aggression. If we do not abide by these principles, we'll be killing each other to the end of time. And the past will never cease to haunt us. So in this relationship between India and China lies hope for the world, for all of humanity. And Sugata's book, I think in a nice way, leads us to that vision. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo. We will now proceed with the panel discussion. We invite the panelists to join us up front. We have the following panelists today. Professor Sugata Bose, Gardner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University, United States, and the author of Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. Dr. Kathleen Burke, Postdoctoral Fellow, Food, Politics and Society Cluster, Asia Research Institute, NUS. Mr. Ravi Veloor, Associate Editor and Senior Columnist at Straits Times and ISAS Honorary Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. The session will be chaired by Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I now hand over the session to Dr. Sevia. Thank you.
You've heard me already, so we're going to go straight into the discussion itself. So, Professor Sugata Bose, could I invite you to take to the podium? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, a very warm thank you to ISAS for hosting this book discussion, especially Iqbal and Harnaik Singh, Jordan Ang. And I really must mention my dear friend, my oldest friend in Singapore, Ambassador Kesavapani, who has been especially enthusiastic in bringing us all together, and also the interest taken by Nilanjana Sengupta and Preeti Dora in having this book discussed in Singapore. I'm especially grateful to my very dear friend George Yeo for his wonderful remarks in the course of his keynote speech. There are 2 points that he made which really struck me. The first is that the road to a better future often lies through a creative re-excavation of the past. And he also, I think, was able to really put his finger on the nature of the book that I have written when he used the term tapestry. I felt as if I was a weaver of Bengal, putting together a Jamdani sari. So that's the kind of character of the book that I have written. In my few minutes, let me try and give you a visual evocation of Asia after Europe. Thank you, Kishore Mahbubani, for joining us. I'll try to give you a visual evocation of Asia after Europe, a book that narrates and interprets the creative process of imagining Asia by tracking the intersecting journeys of Asian intellectuals, artists, and anti-colonial activists during the long 20th century. The year was 1903. Abanindranath Tagore, Rabindranath's nephew, removed a large European painting from the wall of his studio and sold it off to a wealthy art collector. This was to create space for an Asian work of art to be executed by Yokoyama Taikan. The chosen theme was Rash Leela, the love play of Radha and Krishna on a full moon night. Within a few days, the painting was near completion, the sky shone with moonlight, but Taikan was not satisfied. One morning, he arrived to find that the women at home had collected fresh shiuli, a white autumnal flower on a plate, and some had blown across the room. Taikan picked up the flowers and scattered them on his painting in great delight. He then looked at one flower very carefully from all angles and began applying its white and orange colors to his work of art. The moonlit night came alive with a rain of flowers from the sky, and the breeze dropped them in the midst of the dance of Rash Leela. Taikan planted a kodam flower in Radha's hand, draped a garland of shiv-leaf flowers around her neck, and curled a bunch around Krishna's flute as well. At last, the painting was done. It was hung on the wall after Taikan had framed it himself, decorating it with the border of a Baluchari sari. The process of mutual understanding and learning through artistic conversations across Asia unfolded gradually. Taikan and Hishida Shunso embraced Indian themes in their works. Taikan painted the goddess Kali and Hishida Shunso Saraswati, both adorned with white lotuses. Having observed Taikan soak his paintings in water, Abanindranath took the plunge himself and was very impressed with the beautiful effect it had on his canvas. From that moment onwards, the Japanese wash became an intrinsic element in Indian painting. In 1905, Abanindranath painted an arresting image of the mother nation in that style. It was first called Bongo Mata, Mother Bengal, but then it was dedicated to the nation as a whole and retitled Bharat Mata. If the Swadeshi links, and I will mention one point, Taikan came to India in 1903, before the famous Japanese victory over Russia in 1905. So I trace back these conversations between China and India, China and Japan, Vietnam and China and Japan to the 1880s, well before that watershed 1905 moment. Now, if the Swadeshi links of 1905 were primarily cultural, suffused with an anti-colonial spirit, World War I afforded the opportunity for youthful daring on both intellectual and political planes. There was a wonderful young scholar who later came to be acknowledged as the father of Indian sociology, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who spent about 15 months in Japan and China in 1915 and 1916. He went to the Tokyo Imperial University. He had already met Masaharu Anesaki, a scholar of Buddhism at Harvard, who was the first Asian visiting professor at Harvard in the early 20th century. He also met another Japanese scholar of Chinese philosophy and literature, Hattori Unokichi, who had spent time in Peking University in Beida and was poised to go to Harvard in place of Anesaki. And Sarkar had wondered then whether the dream of a professor of philosophy called James Horton Woods to have Indian professors at Harvard will ever materialize. It took nearly 100 years, but it didn't happen, or at least it took about 60 or 70 years. Now, by mid-August 1915, Sarkar mused, "What have I seen in Japan?" And here are his reflections. "In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place." Khapchara was the Bengali word used in those societies. "I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan, yet standing on any street in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported some scraps of iron from Euro-America." Now, it was this feeling, oddly out of place, that was depicted in Florine Stettheimer's oil painting, Studio Party. In it, Sarkar's still figure is placed as an exotic fig leaf in front of Florine's self-portrait on the wall of her studio, which is an animated avant-garde soirée taking place. So the intellectual engagement with Euro-America and the affective bond with Asia represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a new global future. Sarkar visited China, and of course he was enchanted by what he saw of Buddhism in China, but he was even more excited when he met Chinese Muslims. And so theorizing on the subject of Asian unity had come a long way by 1915, 1916 from Okakura's emphasis on the Buddhist arc in his famous book, Ideals of the East, in 1903. In Japan and China, Sarkar had seen Buddhists and understood their historical relationship with India. But he was from Bengal and from a district called Malda, which is about half Hindu, half Muslim. And so he wrote, "But the music that sprang from my heart strings as soon as I encountered Muslims here, why did it not sound on the same strings when I met the Chinese and Japanese Buddhist worshippers of Shakushingho?" And then he has a beautiful lyrical passage on the intermingling of Hindus and Muslims, Hindu and Muslim culture in Bengal in particular, his own province. Now, the 1920s witnessed the interplay of multiple universalisms in an age of mass nationalism. And Asia was one expansive venue for the play of what I call in my book, colorful cosmopolitanisms. A kind of cosmopolitanism which was not an enemy of patriotism, that you could love your own land and yet think of a wider cosmopolitan world. Rabindranath Tagore came to China exactly 100 years ago in 1924, and in May I was in Beijing where Beda organized a conference to observe the 100th anniversary of this Indian poet's visit to China. He was warmly welcomed by Liang Qiqiao, and in fact, Binoy Sarkar's book on China was dedicated to Kang Yu Wei and Liang Qiqiao as the great prophets of a young Asia of the future. Now, not everyone was as effusive as Liang in welcoming Tagore, because the May 4th generation mistook his spirituality for something that was from the past, and they wanted a modern China. But this year was extremely important, and Tagore's message of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had an even friendlier reception in Japan than in China. He had a painter with him, Nandalal Bose, who met Yokoyama Taikan and was introduced to masterpieces of Japanese literature. Another figure who visited Japan a few months after Tagore in 1924 was none other than Sun Yat-sen. And he made his most important political address in Kobe in November of 1924, which I discuss in my book. And in it, he made an unnamed reference to an American scholar called Lothrop Stoddard. He had a BA and a PhD from Harvard University. And his other institutional affiliation, unfortunately, in the early 20s was with the Ku Klux Klan. He had written two books in the early 1920s. One was titled The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And the historian Mac Mazawa has written how it really captured the international mood. And then after that, he published a book called The Revolt Against Civilization. And Sun Yat-sen said that this American scholar considers the awakening of Asia to be a revolt against civilization. But there are civilizations and civilizations. And he talked about the kingly way rather than the despotic way in that famous speech of his. Now, if the streams of Asian universalism and communist internationalism diverged from 1927 onwards, the intertwining of Asian and Islamic universalisms that one sees, for example, in Gandhi's movement in the early 1920s, had a much longer afterlife than might have been expected following the Turkish abolition of the Khilafat in 1924. And I'm very glad that Iqbal quoted Iqbal. No one gave more eloquent expression to a different universalism of Muslims in South and West Asia than the great poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who attended the Second World Islamic Conference in Jerusalem in November of 1931. And that year, Iqbal had argued that the specter of pan-Islamism had been conjured up in the fertile imagination of a lone French journalist. And he proposed dropping pan from the phrase as Islamism sufficed. Much the same could be said at this time about the needless prefix pan that is often attached to the sentiments of Asianism. Now, the 1930s this is Iqbal in Jerusalem in 1931. He's on this far right of the photograph wearing a hat. I discuss the 1930s in great detail in the book. I'll simply say that this was a period when European-style nationalist conflicts afflicted Asia, particularly with China's invasion of Japan in 1937, which undermined the idea of Asia. But one can see that major African-American intellectuals like Du Bois were visiting both Japan and China, and they were often making realist political analyses of what was going on. And Du Bois got to be criticized because he didn't take an unequivocal stand against Japan's attack on China, but Du Bois took a particular kind of position that it was Euro-America that had to be somehow stopped in its tracks, because he was thinking about the unity of all of the oppressed peoples of Asia. And then here you see Subhash Chandra Bose sending an Indian medical mission to China as president of the Indian National Congress. Here are the Indian doctors, first with Subhash Chandra Bose in Calcutta, and then with Mao Zedong in Yan'an. And Tagore and Noguchi, the two poets who had been very close and had met one another in 1916, 24, 29, and Tagore had given a wonderful reception to Noguchi in Shantiniketan in November of 1935. They fell out, and they had an exchange of letters in 1938 on the Japan-China conflict. So I acknowledge that there were these European-style conflicts that were coming into Asia in that period. But there was also more to it, because Xu Beihong, a Chinese artist, came and spent some time in Shantiniketan, and he did this beautiful portrait of Tagore. I visited the Xu Beihong Museum in Beijing last May. It's a beautiful place. I'd strongly encourage all of you to go if you haven't seen it already. He sketched Gandhi, as you see here, and then he traveled up to Darjeeling and he painted the Himalayas, the magic of the Himalayas captured by this Chinese artist in ink and in oils. The artistic milieu of Shantiniketan had to respond to the period of war and famine in the 1940s. This is Nandolal Bose painting in tempera and Japanese wash the Bengal famine. It's called Annapurna. She's seated on a lotus and holds a bowl of rice in her hands, and before her stands Shiva, reduced to a skeleton, holding a begging bowl. Now, by this time, of course, Subhash Chandra Bose was here in Singapore, taking the salute as Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army on the 5th of July, 1943. But what I write about the period of the Second World War focuses to some degree on the ways in which the different freedom movements of Asia came to know each other, despite all of the conflicts taking place in that period. Here he is in Rangoon with the leaders of the Burmese freedom movement. And he knew that paintings and poetry had played a very important part in Asian conversations. So even in the middle of the war, he was visiting the Ueno Museum of Art to see Japanese art, along with his aides Ananda Mohan Sahai and Abid Hassan. Post-war, I show that at least for the first decade, this spirit of Asian solidarity was still alive. My grandfather, Sharat Chandra Bose, visited Burma, and Aung San received him. Both of them were dreaming about an Asian federation in the not too distant future. This was in July of 1946. In March, April 1947, the Asian Relations Conference was held in Delhi. Sarojini Naidu presided, and she gave an absolutely magnificent speech at the opening of that conference. And she asked, who wants a monotonous culture? Who wants a uniform culture? And she was basically one of the best exemplars of the colorful cosmopolitanism that I talk about in this book. And that was the spirit which animated Asia, according to her, at that point. Gandhi was there at the Asian Relations Conference, as you see here, and he wanted, Asia, to save the whole world, as he put it. There were many important conferences that took place in the early 1950s. This is Diogo Rivera's famous mural, which was copied for an Asia-Pacific Peace Conference in Beijing. But what I'm returning to art a little bit towards the very end of my comments, I just wanted to mention that the famous Indian painter, Maqbool Fida Hussain, went to Beijing, and he was honored to meet Qi Baishi, the master of ink painting in China, whom he described as the Matisse of Asia. And he also visited the studio of Xu Beihong. And he was mesmerized to see Xu Beihong's 1,000 horses. And it was Xu Beihong who inspired Hussein to give new vigor to his own horses. So artistic genius had vaulted across the Himalayas. And there used to be a lot of bonhomie in that period. But less than a decade after this kind of bonhomie, of course, India and China would fight a border war in the Himalayas, in this kind of terrain, in what is today Arunachal Pradesh. I was there and took this photograph of the Sila, the pass where some of this conflict took place. Yet even at that moment of rivalry and conflict between nation states, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of modern Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, very evocatively called in a 1960 lecture, Asia as Method. And in the early 1960s, Nandalal Bose celebrated the Indian countryside in his art, creatively drawing on the Japanese Sumie style. And these Asian conversations continued in our art even today. One luminous example is the bridge from Shahid Jalal's exhibition, Memories of Japan, that opened in Lahore in May 2022. So this is the Asian landscape. And during a visit to Iran in 1932, Tagore had pondered over the prospect of the rise of Asia. And he wrote, "We, the people of Asia, we are the people of Asia. Grievances against Europe are in our blood." And that's because of what Europe did to Asia, as he put it, from the late 18th century onwards. Then he reflected, if a new age has dawned in Asia, let Asia give it utterance in a new, authentic voice. If instead Asia merely imitates Europe's beastly cry, were it even to be the lion's roar, it will be a loss. And so he was urging Asians not to follow in the footsteps of European calamity, because that will be the cruel destruction of human possibilities. And I end my book by reflecting on this question: can Asia, after Europe, save itself and the world from such a calamitous fate? In my view, rising to that challenge would require a determined reimagination of a pluralized continentalism, But that power of imagination lies well within the range of the best attributes of Asian universalism that can expand and not destroy the aspirations of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sugata, for laying out some of the major themes and ideas that emerged in your book, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions that will emerge out of those comments. But now I'd like to move to Kathleen, if I could invite you to make your comments. Up to you, whichever you prefer. Sure.
Thank you so much, Iqbal. I'm very pleased to have received the invitation to be here today to provide some comments and reflections on Sugata's book, which I found an extremely engaging and persuasive read. So just quickly a bit about me. I'm a food historian of the Indian Ocean world in what historians call the early modern period. That usually refers to the period between 1500 and 1800. So that's significantly before the period that Sugata talks about in his book. And I use food to construct stories that are marginalized in official archives, the stories of women and enslaved cooks who are often not literate, but who I argue participate in cultural change in the Indian Ocean world. My primary training, I should say, is also in Southeast Asia. So I'm interested in exploring how Southeast Asia fits into broader constructions of the Indian Ocean world. So what I really loved about this book is, Sugata, how you trace these personal stories of individuals in Asia as they move across the continent. They exchange ideas with each other, they learn from each other, and they articulate their own visions of what is Asia. So in my own classes about food and global Asia, I invite students first to examine the genealogy of the category of Asia. From its initial framing from cartographers in ancient Greece. But I also invite them to think about how constructions of the meanings of Asia have changed over time. And I think Sugata's book is a powerful reminder that there were multiple visions of Asia from the perspectives of peoples who lived there. But furthermore, that Asia is not a fixed or unchanging category, and that people imagined all kinds of different solidarities and allegiances that transcended boundaries. So in Sugata's book, one of the most salient of these boundaries is the Eurocentric notion of the nation state. So even in a time when European notions of a nation state was being asserted with violent force, many of the inhabitants of Asia defied these so-called nation state boundaries. So I see the book as very much a challenge to the dominance of the nation state, which continues to reverberate in today's scholarship. And what I also really appreciate about your book, Sugata, is how you look at moments of disconnection alongside moments of connection. And you look at how that impacts these changing visions and imaginaries of Asia. As a historian of the early modern world, I did want to ask you how you might historicize some of the connections that you highlight in your book. Do you see these as part of a larger continuity of Asian connections that have long shaped the Indian Ocean world, long predating the arrivals of Europeans in the 15th century? Or do you think there is a shift in the nature, character, and intensity of these connections during the 19th and 20th centuries when European states became increasingly territorial? So what's different and unique about these kinds of connections that distinguish them from previous ones? So as I said, I'm a historian of gender, food, and particularly non-elite historical actors. So the people who don't always have the privilege of literacy. So I really appreciated your inclusion of the stories of women and subalterns in your narrative. These are the historical actors that I choose to highlight in my work. And I like how you unpack their articulations of Asian solidarities and connections. And you highlight two elite women from India in particular, Sarojini Naidu and Rameshwari Nehru, and their role in advancing women's rights. And you also look at the Asiatic Labour Congresses. So I wondered if I might probe you further on the question of gender and ask you how the Asian artists and intellectuals and activists you spotlight in the book use gender and gendered ideologies to articulate their imaginaries of a united and connected Asia. So scholars have long criticized the role of gendered ideologies in how Europeans constructed notions of the nation state. So I'm curious to know whether the historical actors you examine challenge these colonial gendered ideologies that depicted Asia, for example, as feminized and therefore backward. Did they gender their own visions of Asia? I think you referenced Mother India and Mother Bengal. And if I could add to that questions of social status and hierarchy, to what extent did the visions of Asia you document reproduce or challenge social hierarchies in the region? So thinking about gender led me to think about questions of mobility. And it really struck me that a lot of the historical actors you examine actually moved across borders physically. They had a spatial movement across purported borders. So this led me to reflect on the extent to which physical mobility was a precondition for some of these actors in articulating visions of interconnected and united Asias. And here I'm reminded of Barbara Undaya's work, who's a prominent historian of gender in Southeast Asia. And she shows that mobility for women was structured by all kinds of gendered ideologies, which changed over time and was associated with ideas about women's reproductive labor and social reproduction. And as a result, women were more dominant in shorter mobilities, whereas men dominated the longer scale mobilities. And Michael Pearson has also argued this for the long-standing Indian Ocean trade, that women participated in shorter voyages where men dominated the longer distance. So for the people who did not have the privilege of mobility or had restricted or reduced mobilities due to all these kinds of factors, I wondered what you might say about their role in constructing visions of Asia and how they might have shared in the multiple and overlapping universalisms that you document so lyrically in your book. As a historian primarily of Southeast Asia, I was also pleased to see Southeast Asian actors as part of your narrative. This is important because Southeast Asia is often overlooked in larger epistemic categories of Asia and the Indian Ocean world. So the Indian Ocean world, for those of you who don't know, is actually a scholarly category. It's a category that scholars came up with in a challenge to Cold War area studies to try and examine the interconnections between the regions we today call particularly Asia and Africa. What struck me about your discussion of Southeast Asian actors was actually how few of them moved within Southeast Asia. So you talk about how Jose Rizal goes to Japan, some Vietnamese and Filipino activists and scholars go to Tokyo in Japan. And I wondered if you had a chance to reflect on why this might be. And looking beyond the connections between China, Japan, and India, for which I think you make the case very forcefully, I'm wondering, how do we interpret this in terms of Southeast Asia's role as a center for knowledge production of ideas about Asia within Asia? So I want to conclude with a final remark by saying how much I welcome and congratulate you on this book. And it's certainly a book that I'll be recommending to my undergraduate students when I teach courses on global Asia. I was recently at the Association for Asian Studies conference in Yogyakarta, where I attended a session on the new Cambridge history of Southeast Asia being curated by a series of senior scholars. And what really struck me, I think, highlights the urgency of your book and its challenge to the nation state, because I think even in writing regional histories of Southeast Asia, to some extent, national boundaries are still persistent. They still linger. So some of the senior scholars noted that it was actually very difficult to find scholars who could write regional histories of Southeast Asia because of their primary training really in a single nation, right? And they also noted that there was a tendency for a kind of fixed territorialness. So Indonesians would work on Indonesia, Thai scholars would work on Thailand. So the idea of creating this sort of wider narrative, I think, still faces persistent challenges. And And that just led me to a final question about languages of your sources. So you've translated a lot of this into English for the benefit of your audience. And I just wondered if you might say something about the role of language and how these Asians actors communicated with each other and what role it played in articulating shared visions of a united Asia. So thank you again so much, Sugata.
Thank you, Kathleen. And so what we'll do is we'll have Ravi go first, and maybe you can respond. So Ravi, over to you.
Thank you, Iqbal and ISAS, and thank you, Ambassador Pani, for asking me to be here, Minister. I realize I'm the only non-scholar on this panel, so I'm going to talk in very lay terms and and from the experience that I've had following the Asian story for 45 years next Sunday. In that journey, my 10 years with Asia Week has been the most important in my career. And partly because I joined Asia Week in my late 20s, when you're very impressionable, but also because the mission of Asia Week was founded by two editors, T.J.S. George and Michael O'Neill, who left Far Eastern Economic Review, because they thought the review presented too much of a British view of things, and they wanted an Asian voice. And I wrote down the founding mission statement of Asia Week, and it was, I quote, "to see the world from an Asian perspective and to be Asia's voice in the world." So against that background and this early years of training, Sugata, I found your sketches of the growing Asian identity very useful to understand my own journey in Asia as a nation. I was born in India, Indian passport. I'm Singaporean now, and increasingly, as I get older, it's the stuff that I write about is more and more about issues that matter to a wider humanity in Asia, more than even a Singaporean or an Indian perspective. And of course, you do a wonderful job of sketching out how this Asian identity evolved. You talked here of Okakura, and then in your book, you speak about the maritime links, as passenger shipping, came on Asia, so people traveled. And then even the famines, the great famines of Bengal and Henan. And thank you also for mentioning the Tonkin, famine, because I think a lot of us in Asia don't remember that as much as we do the Bengal famine and the China famine in China. Now, having said that, let me speak a little bit about a few strands in the book that provoke deeper thought, and how the very concept of Asia has come under stress lately. You speak about West Asia in your book. And, I'm so glad that you consistently use that term rather than, the colonial construct of Middle East. But, and when I was reading through it, it amazed me that delegates from every West Asian state, including Lebanon, as you said, attended the first Asian Socialist Congress in Rangoon in 1952 or 1953. Right? And that at the Asian Relations Conference, which you mentioned, there was a delegate from Egypt. And that at that point, the concept of Asia was wide enough to even include North Africa. So, but somehow we have lost that along the way, and I suspect some of it is deliberate, because we as people who administer a very troubled region ourselves, do not want the issues of the Middle East to come and impinge on us here. We don't want to import those issues, especially because of many of us are multicultural societies, and we are affected by what happens on the Palestinian issue. So we are careful. So we deliberately keep it away. But if you look at the flows that are coming up in Asia between West Asia and the rest of Asia, increasingly Southeast Asia, but South Asia particularly, I do believe that we really have to pay attention to that part of the world as a part of us. And, I'm being only, some couple of years ago, I wrote a column saying that the Middle East Institute should be folded into ISAS. And, it's time that we actually looked at this region as, as one unit, because of the flows. I know it's very uncomfortable for you, Iqbal, but I thought I'd just mention that.
And I'm not endorsing that institutionally in any way.
Yeah. So now, a latter-day manipulation of the concept of Asia is what you mentioned yourself. New concepts like the Indo-Pacific that sort of deny the Asianness, because of whatever reasons, essentially geopolitics that are weighing on this whole concept. And I thought you were actually absolutely correct in saying that a British empire in decline and an American empire on the rise. I think your exact words were that they're not prepared to allow Asia to contrive its own destiny. And that I can tell you from my own experience. I mentioned Asia Week a little while ago. After the founders sold to American interests, they brought in American editors, the whole character of Asia Week changed. And in 2001, they shut down the magazine. Because Time, that was the owner then, I suspect, wanted to extend the mother brand, Time Asia in Asia. And they didn't want Asia Week to thrive or survive. They cited an advertising downturn as the excuse to close it. But some of us who spent a lot of time in Asia Week, we tried to buy the title and thought we could revive it, but Time magazine wouldn't sell. So it was a deliberate, almost what you might see as a neo-colonial way of acting. They wouldn't sell the title. Now, one of the sad things that we see around us today is that Asian states that were themselves, subjugated in various ways, are now showing an instinct to dominate. I speak to senior Chinese people, and in private conversations, they do tell you that, for instance, in ASEAN, they're very happy to see ASEAN come up as an integrated economic unit, but they'd be very uncomfortable to see it develop as a political unit. And if you see what India is doing in South Asia with SAARC, it's pretty much that. So nationalisms are coming in the way of even regionalisms, but they don't mind. RCEP, that's fine, but if it ever ASEAN coheres as a political entity, I think we're going to see a lot of pushback from a lot of people. A third thing that we see is as the imperative of nation building rises, there is a tendency to deny the common heritage. In 1992, I spent a few weeks in Pakistan, and I was trying to record the oral histories of people who lived through the partition of India. And I met a man called Chaudhry Abdul Hamid. He used to run a very popular bookshop in Anarkali Bazaar of Lahore. And Chaudhry was already in his 80s then, and he died a couple of years after I met him. But Chaudhry was an eyewitness to Nehru calling for Purna Swaraj. Purna Swaraj, for those who you don't understand, is full independence. In 1929, there was a Congress convention on the banks of the Ravi River, and Nehru, surprising even his father, asked for full independence. And that was a bit of a shocker then. So I asked Chaudhry Sahab to take me to that place where this thing was done. He took me to that very spot, but there was not a tablet, there was not a single marker to make that, to mark that historic site. I mean, from which so much of Asia, would be affected later. And that's because for Pakistan, what was most important date for them is not 1929, but 1940, when there was a call for Pakistan. The Muslim League asked for Pakistan. And so for them, the important monument is the Minar-e-Pakistan. And another very sobering lesson that we need to learn, and Sugata, you do say that how quickly we have imbibed these Western concepts of unitary sovereignty and rigid borders. Today, the borders have become even more rigid than they were, when we got our freedom. And you bring that out very well in that treatment of the Asian Relations Conference. This was even before India got independence, a few months, 3 or 4 months before. And there was a dispute over the map that was shown at the back, which you talk about. And the Chinese delegates were very unhappy because Tibet was colored in a different color from the rest of China. So Nehru agreed. And the Chinese delegate quickly went and colored Tibet in the same. I thought it was so poignant to think of that. And just as you said, the famines of the 40s created a common feeling. But today, unfortunately, there are bigger threats over water, for instance, in Asia. But that's only causing more divisions, In the 40s, we felt united over issues like survival of, but today, those very issues have become so divisive for us in Asia, and that's such a tragedy. And we are unable to work together on climate change, which I think there's no region in the world today that needs to cooperate on climate change in Asia, because this is where we are being hit. The world is being hit through Asia more than any other place in the world. So let me conclude by saying that Sugata's book has made me reflect on an Asia that might have been, and some fatal choices that may have appeared small at the time, but changed, what Minister George, you might say, the flow of the river. Minister says, ultimately the river will find its way to the sea, but there are boulders that come in the way that shift the course of the river while it's on its way to the sea, and those boulders are very important sometimes. We don't recognize it when it happens. Let me start with Muhammad Ali Jinnah asking for permission, writing to Maharaja Hari Singh of Kashmir, saying that, look, I'm very sick, dying of tuberculosis, and I want to spend some time in the valley because my doctors have recommended it. Hari Singh says, no, you're not welcome here. And that act set in train so many events that today the two countries are not even talking to each other. Every time I go to Delhi and on Janpath, when I pass the Claridge's Hotel, I look across the street and there's a mansion that used to belong to Jinnah. And Jinnah kept it even after partition. And I often thought that the reason Jinnah didn't sell out when he moved, because he must have thought that after partition things would be normal and people would go back and forth and he could come and live there. The second one you talk about, Sugata, in your book, and that is the Chow En-lai visit to New Delhi in 1960. And the offer of a package solution where you settle, you keep Arunachal and we keep Aksai Chin. And I can't imagine if that offer had been accepted instead of spurned. And Morarji Desai actually was rude to Chou En-lai during that trip. Minister spoke about Xuan Zang. So I accompanied Minister and Sugata and Amartya Sen to Nalanda to the memorial hall for Xuan Zang that the Chinese built in Nalanda. And it was a beautiful it's a beautiful work. And with a huge metal bell from Shanghai that's at the front of the thing. And the thought that crossed my mind was, all these people, these Chinese artisans that worked there for nearly 2 years, in that heat of the Bihar, power cuts, unfamiliar food, and the temple is really a beautiful thing. So, Minister, when he spoke about animosity and, perhaps even a little contempt for each other now, when I think about that, I think about what might have been, and what really probably exists under the surface and maybe can be brought up someday. And I want to conclude by talking about a last fatal choice. And this comes back to Singapore in some ways. In 2009, in October, I followed Minister to Sri Lanka, and we went to Jaffna. And you were at the Nallur Kandasamy temple, I don't know if you remember, on Deepavali Day. And, Minister, just a few kilometers away is the Perumal temple in Jaffna. And in 1975, that is where Velupillai Prabhakaran shot dead the mayor of Jaffna, Alfred Duraiappa, and that began his career in militancy and all that. Now, I'm saying this because when I was looking at you at the temple, I was thinking, Velupillai, that's Prabhakaran's father, he used to work here in Singapore. He's a lowly fellow, in some small job. He goes home to Jaffna to take a wife, and then decides to stay back, works for the land office thereafter. And I used to think that, suppose he'd chosen to stay here, back in Singapore. He might have done national service with you. You're both born in the same year, Minister. 1954. So every time I look back at these things, I think about these small things in history that can make such a big change to nations and societies. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ravi, for putting we've moved from the pre-modern period to the contemporary period, and I thank both panelists for actually not just discussing the book but raising some questions which I think are very engaging with what you've Sugata, what you've written about. So perhaps let's start with yourself, if you'd like to address some of these questions.
Okay, I'll briefly address a few of the questions that have been raised, but I would also, of course, like to hear from the audience who might have more questions. First of all, thank you very much, Kathleen, for your comments. You asked me how I historicize the Asian connections. As you know, as a historian of the Indian Ocean, for a very long time, there was a focus on the early modern period. Your centuries, 1500 to 1800, had been really worked on by the great historians of the Indian Ocean, K.N. Chaudhary, Ashin Dasgupta, Mike Pearson, and so on. And there was often a tendency to stop at 1800. The assumption was that with the onset of European imperial domination, the old organic links that connected the Indian Ocean world had been sundered. And in an earlier book, 100 Horizons, about which I've also spoken here in Singapore, I really wanted to write about the flows of capital and labor, skills and services, ideas and culture that continued to link the Indian Ocean in the modern period, in the 19th and the 20th centuries. So what I do here in this book is to show how 19th century and 20th century intellectuals, artists, political figures reinterpreted the pre-modern bonds across Asia. So they were very interested in the old oceanic connections, for example, of trade and culture, but they were living in a qualitatively different period where much of Asia was under British or French or Dutch or American imperial rule, and therefore, anti-colonial solidarity came to play a much stronger role than whatever they might have been able to garner from Asia's past and the earlier links, even though they did so very creatively. Even the bonds of religion. What is interesting is that Buddhist universalism, Islamic universalism were drawn upon in the service of building an Asian solidarity. And there weren't those kinds of conflicts which we see sort of today. Just imagine, during Gandhi's first non-cooperation movement, and I mentioned this somewhere in the book, in the Shwedagon, Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists were speaking together. And so there was the possibility of a peaceful coexistence of Islamic and Buddhist universalisms in Southeast Asia, something that got lost with the adoption of the European model of the modern nation state. So I look at the reinterpretations of pre-modern bonds in this modern period. You raise important questions about gender, and here I have to say that some of the even very prominent women thinkers who envisioned Asian unity sometimes used the figure of gender in the same way as the men of that period. One good example is Sister Nivedita. And she wrote the foreword to Okakura's famous book, The Ideals of the East. Okakura, of course, had a famous first sentence, as most of you would know, Asia is one. And Nivedita decided to embellish it further by writing, Asia, the great mother, is forever one. So in terms of envisioning the nation, or even a broader conception of Asia in feminine terms, was something that occurred in this particular period. However, using the figure of gender is not the same thing as promoting women's rights and gender equality. But that too was done in venues or on forums where Asia had been reimagined. I write in this book about an All-Asia Women's Conference that was convened in Lahore in 1931. In addition to the Purna Swaraj resolution being passed in Lahore in 1929 and the famous resolution of the Muslim League, even though the resolution did not mention Pakistan or partition in 1940, it was in the town hall gardens that this women's conference was held. And Sarojini Naidu was supposed to preside, but she was in jail, having taken part in Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, so others had to substitute for her. But in those kinds of gatherings, women's equality was something that was put forward as a demand, and women's rights were being talked about. And one other point that I will make is that I decided to pay a lot of attention to the unofficial or the semi-official Asian conferences of the 1940s and 1950s, and not just focus on, let us say, Bandung in 1955, because I found that Bandung already had a little bit of a statist bias. So the freedom struggles in Asia and Africa were not represented at Bandung. Only the countries which had already acquired political independence had seats at the table. But there was something more. If you look at the proceedings of Bandung, there was practically nothing on gender. Women's rights were missing. And yet, if you look at the Asian Relations Conference of the spring of 1947, a whole range of Asia conferences in Southeast Asia, in China, even a few days before Bandung in Delhi, and then a year after Bandung in Cairo, there you see women and youth and students playing a bigger role, and the gender question and women's rights are very much on the agenda of these meetings. The statist gatherings tended to have a fairly strong male bias, and even on the actual agenda, you find gender not figuring very, very prominently. So that's worth mentioning. Just very quickly about mobility and immobility, I actually try and show how there's a dialectical relationship between the two. It's precisely in the period that much of agrarian Asia was settled and sedentarized that you also see mobility of labor. Indentured labor moving out from the mid-1830s across the Indian Ocean and so on. So we need to see mobility and immobility in a dialectical sense. And yes, of course, I probably privileged those who did move around and who encountered one another in new locations. But there were plenty of other people who did not travel, but traveled in their imagination. And I do, address some of those writings as well in this book. You raise a very important question about language. How did they communicate with one another? And even within, let's say, Southeast and East Asia, there were, of course, linguistic barriers. But let us say, going back to the 1880s, a Chinese scholar, a Japanese scholar, a Vietnamese scholar could get together in Shanghai and write a common history of the French colonial conquest of Vietnam because they could communicate in literary Sinetic. And, they often had a shared script. Or when a Phan Boi Chau of Vietnam went to Tokyo, and Tokyo figures prominently because it was an anti-colonial metropolis before Berlin and Paris became those kinds of spaces for diasporic Asians to meet. There, Phan Boi Chau and Liang Chi-Chiao could not understand each other, but they could speak in a common brush language. They could write in a script that both could understand. So that's how Liang Chi-Chiao and Phan Boi Chau were able to communicate. But this does not take away anything from the fact that the language of the colonizer was sometimes important and helped in communications. So that, I cite Barmore, who wrote a book called Breakthrough in Burma, and he did say that, when Asian leaders met, Subhash Chandra Bose and Barmore and Jose Laurel could talk to one another more easily because two of them, Subhash Chandra Bose and Barmore, had been educated in Cambridge in England, and Jose Laurel had a law degree. And therefore, there were those ways of communication as well. But the most important point is that, as Sarojini Naidu argued very powerfully in 1947, she refused to accept the barrier of language, that it could be, transcended through simply an inspirational, effort. And she, of course, spoke and wrote poetry in beautiful English, but, she basically was saying that the language barrier is not insurmountable and making a powerful argument about that. So I simply wanted to just say that, the reason why I try to bring in West Asia and Southeast Asia, even though I think George is right, India and China loom large in the book, and that's because I decided that the idea of Asia is actually far more important than the map of Asia. So I went wherever my story took me. And I think Iqbal was mentioning this in his introductory remarks. I refused to simply be imprisoned by, European cartographic depictions of Asia, I felt that the Asian imaginations of Asia had a creative spark that was missing in what the European geographers and cartographers did with our continent. So that's the direction in which I meant. And I think you make a very important point, Ravi, about various missed opportunities, roads not taken. And, in European historiography, there is a burgeoning literature on lost Europes. And in a way, I think we would benefit from recovering some of the lost visions of Asia. I must mention in Singapore my dear friend Wang Gangwu, who has blurbed my book, and he says something very interesting, that I capture the hopes and misjudgments of generations of Asian thinkers, and he says he makes us wonder if the US-led international system based on sovereign nation-states and the new nationalisms that this system produced might have lured Asia too far for its alternative forms of universalism to succeed. Now, I hope that is not the case, that these Asian universalisms might still be recovered and rescued. And Wang Gangwu himself hinted at that in a beautiful little book that he published called Renewal in 2013. And in it he showed, for example, that a Chinese thinker, Gu Hongming, who spent time in Singapore and in mainland China, was being rediscovered in early 21st century China. And this is a figure I discovered, Gu Hongming, whom Vinay Sarkar had met in 1915 in China. And they were having these, conversations. So some of these ideas, I think, need to be recovered. I do, of course, have a statement in my book that the vision of Gu Hongming post-2013 has been swept aside somewhat by the thought of Xi Jinping. I think there are these ideas that can go out of circulation for a while, but can then still be drawn upon to imagine, a much, better Asia. I agree with you that 1960 April was a lost opportunity. Chu Enlai was there in Delhi for a week, and we now have the full transcript. One of my former students, found it and wrote about it, and that's why I think that it's quite important to recover creative, political, and economic ideas that may have lost out at the formal moment of political decolonization in much of Asia, but may have renewed salience for all of Asia today, if we don't want to fall victim to European-style nationalist conflicts yet again in the foreseeable future.
On that note, the floor is open for questions. Could I just request that you briefly introduce yourself before asking your question? Thank you so much. So I see. Do you want to go first? Is there a mic? Is there a mic?
My name is Sundar Viswalingam. I'm from Chicago. I'm an independent researcher in South Asian traditions. In fact, I used to attend Professor Bose's events in Tufts University around 1991. Probably doesn't remember, but anyway, I have actually two questions. The first is regarding the concluding paragraph of your book, the cautionary note from Tagore. So much of your book is actually, Japan plays a very big role, aside from China and India, in this whole notion of Asian universalism right from the beginning. And yet, the book ends, so there's a kind of optimism as regarding imagining Asia, but at the same time, it ends with this cautionary note of imitating Europe to defeat Europe, in fact, to defeat America in the case of Japan, with tragic consequences not only for the rest of Asia, but for Japan itself. So I wonder, and I think you would be the best person to ask this question, how does one then situate the kind of options and path taken by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, in opting for Japan and violence, and raising the Indian National Army here in the Malay Peninsula, as opposed to Gandhi and peace. So the first question with regard to, juxtaposing Tagore's cautionary note at the end of your book and Subhash Chandra Bose. So that's the first question. The second question is, I really hesitate to follow your use of, your borrowing of the term universalism and Asian universalism. Of course, there is such a thing as Buddhist universalism, grant that. Islamic universalism, yes. But was there ever really such a thing as Asian universalisms? Did Asia ever really speak in one voice? And of course, there are there were commonalities. And the commonalities were largely also due to the spread of Buddhism, Islam, the religious perspective, but many other sorts of commonalities. But it seems to me that the term universalism here is being used as a kind of reaction against Western universalism, where the term is appropriate. See, recently, in his recent visit to China, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim spoke precisely of this. It's on YouTube. He was being interviewed by a Chinese intellectual, and he spoke of Asian universalism to counter Western universalism. And his Chinese interlocutor then corrected him and said, the word universalism has all kinds of negative connotations. Are you sure? Is that what? When he pointed out some of these connotations. And then Anwar Ibrahim really immediately said, yes, you're right. We should speak in terms of commonalities rather than universalism. So it seems to me that if there is such a thing as universalism, Asian universalism, it is probably something in the future, rather than something that ever existed. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Let's collect two or three, and then I'll try to respond.
Preeti Ravra, I work in the President's Office at NTU. Sugata, thank you for your book and presentation, which really paints an exquisite portrait of Asia, and really coming together in a Ras Leela of art, intellectual and political ideas. Mr. Yo also spoke eloquently about how monks traveled within Asia and created this Buddhist universalism. But today, both Buddhism, art, and these intellectual ideas have been politicized and reduced to petty nationalism. I wonder if you'd like to talk about how Tagore and Netaji would have thought of what have viewed of this post-colonial India and Asia as it stands today.
Now, the role of Japan in the period from the late 19th century to 1945 is a very complex one. You already see, Japan playing a very aggressive role towards, China in the 1890s. But at the same time, with the failure of the 100 Days reforms in 1898 in China, you begin to see both revolutionaries and reformers, coming to Japan, and these included Kang Yu-wei, Liang Qiqiao, Sun Yat-sen, of course, and therefore there was always a degree of ambivalence towards China. And this is very evident in Sun Yat-sen's speeches and writings, even after he was able to build the Republic. And Sun Yat-sen was politically successful where some of his other compatriots were not, largely because he was able to mobilize what Tim Harper has called the village abroad in the Malay Peninsula, in Penang and Singapore and so on. And so he became the father of the Republic. Now, on the question of Netaji and Japan, as I mentioned, Subhash Chandra Bose was quite critical of Japan's invasion of China in 1937. And he wrote an article which came out in the Modern Review titled Japan's Role in the Far East. And his sympathies were with China. But he also provided a realist political analysis of what was going on in East Asia. But when it came to the ethical aspect, and this is also answering Preeti's question, he ended his essay by saying that India should search for national self-fulfillment in every direction, but not through the path of imperialist self-aggrandizement, of which he, accused Japan. He sent the medical mission to China. He was the president. He organized All India China Day, raised funds for China, and so forth. But then we have to understand that Japan's role, was in relation to Northeast Asia, was that of a colonial power in relation to Korea, certainly, the aggressor when it came to China, an aggressor when it came to Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. But then all of South and Southeast Asia were ruled by European colonial powers, and the United States as well in the Philippines. And so when it came to an international war crisis, I think he took the decision that he must take advantage of it to advance the cause of India's freedom. And he knew, after 20 years of being in the movement led by Gandhi, that the civilian masses had all rallied to the Indian National Congress, but the Indian soldiers were still loyal to the British King Emperor. So he needed access to these Indian soldiers and to instill in them a new loyalty to the cause of Indian and, by extension, Asian freedom. So that was his sort of line of thinking. That was what brought him to Asia, and he played a very major role here from 1943 to 1945. I would not make a very big distinction between Gandhi's position and Netaji's position in this period. If you think about the Quit India movement of August of 1942, Gandhi did not hesitate to launch a mass movement, and I think he was encouraged by the fact that Britain had been defeated, at least temporarily, by Japan in Southeast Asia. And he was saying quite openly that he would negotiate with Japan, and if the British quit India, then the Japanese would have no reason to come into India. And if you read all of Mahatma Gandhi's comments on Netaji post-1945, until his own assassination in January 1948, it's amazing that each one is in the form of a eulogy. He actually was supporting the way in which Netaji had raised the Indian National Army. And of course, he was particularly admiring of the fact that he was the one who had built unity among Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, all the different linguistic groups of India, from Punjabis to Tamils, on the basis of equality. So I think post-1942, the aims and ideologies of these two leaders of the Indian independence movement had come much closer together. On the question of universalism, I always qualify the use of that term with an adjective, a different universalism, or perhaps in the plural, different universalisms. Universalism that was very different from European from the European claim to monopoly on universalism, something very different from European definitions of reason, of national identity, a kind of universalism that emanated from Asia, of which Asia was not simply the boundary, and which in fact could embrace multiple races and religions, rather than have a rather exclusive European and Christian foundation. So that's the sense in which I do talk about multiple and contending universalisms. So there could be religiously tinged universalisms. Even communist internationalism is a universalism of that kind, post-1917. But I think that there is something to be said about Asian different universalisms. I also use the other phrase, colorful cosmopolitanism, because there is a tendency to think in dominant European philosophy that cosmopolitanism has to be drawn from abstract reason. That's the Kantian notion of cosmopolitanism, and that somehow cosmopolitanism and patriotism are opposites. That cosmopolitanism has to be colorless, otherwise it gets to be seduced by this kind of patriotism which is reduced to particularism. But what I show is that all of the major Asian philosophers of this period, Tagore included, had deep love for their own country, wrote Iqbal, all wrote effervescent poetry about their own homelands, and yet could, transcend those cultural boundaries to think about larger, cultural exchanges and so on. So that's, the colorful cosmopolitanism and different universalism are the two concepts or phrases that I deploy in this particular book. And I had given my English translation of what Tagore read in Bengali in closing my introductory comments, but in answer to both Preeti and you, I'll simply just quote from him as he is. I mean, he said that he had always admired Japan, but then he said, unfortunately, that the presumptive leader of Asia had not learned the art of civilization which heals and unites, but had, quote, trained her hands under Europe in the science that inflicts wounds with efficiency. And that's the calamity that he wanted Asia to somehow avoid, and which I'm in some ways echoing in the early 21st century.
We'll go for another round of questions. Can I have Ambassador?
Sugata, Kishore Mahbubani, thank you for mentioning me. I want to apologize to Iqbal, George, and you for arriving late. Unfortunately, sometimes life gets very interesting. You get distracted by something else. But I look forward to reading your book, and I think your book is very timely because, as you know, I've always said the 21st century will be the Asian century. But what I find curious about our times is that when you look back at where we were 100 years ago, right? China was being trampled, India was colonized, or most of Southeast Asia colonized, except Thailand. We are in a much better position today than we've ever been. And everybody can see that Asia is rising, but no Asian wants to take ownership of it. There's almost no Asian leader, or even a sort of a major, Asian thinker or whatever, is saying, hey, this is Asia's moment. What can we do with it? How do we discover what was our ancient souls? How do we maybe move away and perhaps create concepts that might be more relevant to us? Like, for example, as you hinted at, sovereignty. I mean, frankly, absolute sovereignty in an interdependent world, in a planet suffering from climate change, doesn't make sense. Right? We are cabins in a boat that is sinking. Why protect your cabin if you're not going to protect the boat? So why isn't it the greater desire on the part of Asian intellectuals and so on and so forth to create the sense of ownership of Asia? Whereas by contrast, in the US and Europe, they're still speaking very eloquently about how still Western universalism is the answer of all of humanity's problems.
How can we bring different nations together? Like Vietnam, they have their own problems. So like Asia also have their own problems. So if every country is rigid, then we need to find ways to stagnate it. Yeah, that's about it.
Is there any more hands? Going once, going twice. I hand over and would you
interpret the second question? Well, I'm delighted you're here. Kishore Mahbubani has been, writing about the rise of Asia for some time, and also one theme that probably hasn't been, adequately discussed today is the economic trajectory. And this book, when it was first conceived, was probably going to be an economic history of Asia during the last 2 centuries. But in the course of research and writing, it changed. But there is a strong dose of economic history and political economy in this book as well. In some ways, it begins with what has been called the Great Divergence in the economic fortunes of Europe and Asia, which can be more or less dated to the second decade of the 19th century, the 1810s. This is when India was no longer able to sell its artisanal products, its manufactured products in world markets. This is when Indian opium began to pay for China tea as the most lucrative item in the East India Company's trade and so on. So there's nothing ancient about Asia's poverty. It's a modern phenomenon, and and at least the divergence between Europe and Asia has been dated to about 200 years ago. And overall, if we look at, as these 200 years have unfolded, there, definitely has been a rise of Asia. And there was a particular inflection point, 1978-79, when, that momentum became almost inexorable, with China at the leading edge, but many other parts of Asia also being, part of that general rise, including Southeast Asia. So throughout this book, the material life, the challenges of existence, poverty and prosperity, in fact, provide the backdrop to the story that I tell about the intellectual, cultural interactions in trying to imagine Asia. To be quite honest, I don't, have a satisfactory answer to your question as to why is somebody not prepared to take ownership of this rise of Asia. Perhaps there is, to some degree, an attempt to do so, particularly by China and its leadership. But it's always tricky when one country wants to be the leader of Asia. We saw how Japan foundered, sort of in the course of the early 20th century, which is why there was both admiration and criticism of Japan's role in Asia. And when one country tries to take on that sort of leadership, and perhaps Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative is one way of trying to seize that ownership of the rise of Asia. Suspicions are raised, and others in Asia don't feel too comfortable with that. But having said that, it really is very striking that at a time when Asia was semi-colonized, during an era of what has been seen as humiliation by Europe, there seemed to be, more in terms of intellectual leadership, that we never succumbed to, a scenario where we would not be able to put forward our own ideas about not just the rise of Asia, but a global future. And this is important to note. There was no real cultural defensiveness as such. It's not as if we were trying to just protect our own domain, but we had a certain vision of, what global relations ought to be looking like. And this was often put in the language of the futurism of young Asia. That the future would, belong to us. And it is a pity that, in political terms, certainly in economic terms, there has been a certain rise of Asia. And yet, in some ways, there were greater intellectuals during the period of colonial rule, and which is why, in some ways, maybe have been trying to draw on their ideas and saying that there's something to be learned from their example in the present. And this is in relation to both your question and the other question that was raised. Yes, there are rivalries. We have internalized too much the European model of the nation state, and that hinders our ability to tackle the most important challenges facing the globe today, of which I think the preeminent one is that of climate change. But it's precisely because of that. Kishore Mahbubani, talked about the concept of sovereignty. We seem to have just accepted uncritically an import from Europe into Asia of the mid-19th century, that of unitary sovereignty, that there can only be one sovereign over any particular piece of territory. And yet, if you think about, Asian, both pre-colonial and anti-colonial political thought, the best in it, you would find that there would have been very creative ideas of shared sovereignty or layered sovereignty. There were very creative ideas in the early 20th century about a federal India, which accommodates all its differences, even a federal China, which would then come together in a larger Asian federation. These were the kinds of ideas that were being promoted. Think of Mao Zedong. He talked about a sovereign Hunan at one point in the early 1920s. This was very different from the Mao of the 1950s and 1960s, leading an authoritarian party state. So there were all of these creative ideas. So if we are not able to rethink sovereignty, and this is one of the gifts that we have from the era of anti-colonial political thought, and if we can't reimagine borders between states, which were very often fuzzy boundaries, Asian intellectuals and political thinkers were quite comfortable with not drawing borders rigidly in linear fashion. If we are not able to do these two things, then we'll be missing this great opportunity of the 21st century being an Asian century. And all that I'm saying is that there is enough resources, intellectual as well as political economic, which can be drawn from Asia's own history that can light up the path ahead.
We've touched the 6 o'clock mark, but I'm going to take one last question. And so if you can be brief, thanks.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Sugata. My name's Michael Laffin. I'm a friend of Iqbal's brother. I hear a lot of we here, and I was thinking about, colonialism, after all, was a spatial continuum that didn't respect the beginning or end of Asia. And I wonder where in your own thinking, or among the thinkers you read, when did or should Africa matter to Asia after Europe?
Africa, and even, African America, mattered from fairly early on, which is why, and it's not just because of his Harvard connection, that W.E.B. Du Bois suddenly figures in my book. He actually came to Japan and China in 1936. And later, well into the 1950s, when I was talking about these various unofficial and semi-official Asia conferences taking place, Asia-Pacific conferences taking place, there were, Du Bois was constantly sending messages of solidarity and support and comradeship and so on. And so there was this notion that oppressed peoples shared their experience and therefore needed to shape some kind of a common future. Africa, of course, figured, if you think about Bandung, it was at an Asian venue, but it was billed as an Asia-Africa conference. There were not very many African representatives at that point, but once that idea had gathered momentum, that Asia must now, transcend its own boundaries and include, Africa, you find a whole range of the unofficial conferences. So, already a year after Bandung in Cairo, all of the freedom movements of African colonies, which had not yet won independence, found representation. So I think there is an early history which goes back to the interwar period, and then already in the 1940s, as Ravi was mentioning, even at the Asian Relations Conference, there was at least representation from North Africa and West Asia, but gradually the whole of the African continent was included in what was seen as an hyphenated Asia-Africa identity. And then, of course, there's a later history as well, which includes, which begins to include Latin America, and there the economics of the post-Second World War period plays an important role, and that is what has led us today to the concept of the global South. So, but Africa has figured quite early on, and I'll end with just a little anecdote. I know we have crossed the 6 o'clock mark. That, as I mentioned, even Asia-Pacific meant that one could include North America and Latin America, and there were African-American labor leaders who came to Beijing to the Asia-Pacific Peace Conference. And there, an African-American labor leader, Louis Wheaton, basically brokered an India-Pakistan joint declaration on Kashmir. And the British had hoped that as soon as Kashmir was raised, the unity of these Asian countries would fracture. They would have to move their attention away from what was going on in Malaya at that point, the emergency, and Korea, where the war had just, was coming to an end. But in fact, an African-American labor leader brought the Indian and Pakistan delegates together, and a joint declaration was not only passed, but there was a great degree of affection that was expressed among Indian and Pakistani delegates in Beijing. This is 1952. And of course, I discovered I couldn't put it in my book. I was recently in Bangladesh, like you, George, and I discovered that one of the Pakistan delegates to this particular conference was none other than Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And his vivid account of his visit to what he calls the New China is now available. The manuscript was discovered recently. And talking about language, Kathleen, there were two delegates to this conference who gave their speeches in Bengali. One was the then delegate from Pakistan, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founder of Bangladesh. This was the year of the language movement in East Bengal. And the other was a novelist from West Bengal, a man called Manoj Basu, both of whom wrote their own first-hand accounts of what they saw in China. And Mujibur Rahman had to explain why a delegate from India and a delegate from Pakistan was speaking in a common language, Bengali. And one of the points that he made was that, this is the language of Rabindranath Tagore. Thank you.
Before calling to close the formal part of the discussion, I would like to express our gratitude to Nirmala and her team and the National Library Board for being our venue partners. And they've kindly allowed us to have a little bit of a reception after this as well. So again, would you please join me to congratulate Professor Bose and thank the panelists for their discussions today. Now, the formal part of the discussion has ended, but I believe the conversation will continue over bites at the back. So please join us. Thank you so much.
Congratulations.